"Step out of the car!" he barked, because in his world, a black woman behind the wheel of a Maybach was already guilty. No questions, no hesitation, just violence. He shoved her, cursed her, humiliated her, all while the most powerful man in the state sat silently in the back seat, watching. The cop didn't recognize him. He didn't care. His prejudice was louder than his reason. But what happens when blind racism collides with brutal reality? What happens when the entire country sees it unfold in real time? Are you watching this from your phone, your laptop, or your TV? Stick around, because the ending will hit harder than you think, and you won't have to wait long. The story starts now. Twilight settled over Lakefield's quiet edge. That hour when day turns syrupy and the world seems both peaceful and uneasy. Simone Harris drove with a care that came from years of being watched, measured, and, until recently, dismissed. The Maybach glided along the tree-lined avenue, its polished black surface reflecting neon shop lights and dying sun. She felt the weight of the car, the expensive hush of German engineering beneath her palms. Once, not long ago, Simone would have never even dared look at a car like this, let alone touch one. Now, every evening, she was trusted with it. That trust meant more to Simone than any title. For much of her life, she'd lived with what little she could carry, in shelters or the back seats of battered cars, invisible and overlooked. Then came a chance, a hand up, a fresh suit, a key, and a job driving someone important enough that people moved aside when he passed. She never forgot where she started, nor how quickly luck could turn. She was on her way to pick up her passenger after another late meeting downtown. That was the new routine. Park in the shadow of City Hall, wait as the crowd thinned, then carry her quiet client through the dimming city back to the safety of his home. Tonight, he climbed into the back seat in silence, eyes tired, shoulders slumped under a plain sports coat. He nodded to her with a brief, silent gratitude, and Simone caught his eyes in the rear view only once before setting off. The drive was usually peaceful. Tonight, the roads were almost empty. Even the corner store had its shutters down. The world outside was the soft thrum of summer cicadas and a few porch lights winking on, and Simone was grateful for the silence that let her steady her breath and focus. Her passenger stayed quiet, no small talk, no orders, just the flicker of a phone screen illuminating his hands. That was when she saw the sudden bloom of red and blue behind her in the mirror. Her first instinct, drilled by too many nights like this, was to keep her hands on the wheel, slow the car, and pull gently to the curb. She let the Maybach roll to a perfect stop under a flickering street lamp, heart hammering in her chest, mouth suddenly dry. The police cruiser idled close behind, headlights glaring. Two officers sat inside. Simone took in their postures. A younger man in the passenger seat, upright and already reaching for the door, and an older one at the wheel, arms folded, gaze unreadable. Simone had seen this tableau before. She knew how easily such encounters slid from routine to threat. The younger officer approached first, steps clipped and brisk, boots scuffing the pavement. Simone watched him in the side mirror, white, maybe late 20s, jaw clenched tight, name tag catching the lamplight, Cole. She read the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed before he tapped the butt of his flashlight against the car window, hard enough to make her flinch. She forced herself to breathe slowly and deeply. She glanced once at the rearview mirror. Her passenger looked up, but only briefly, his face blank, unreadable, as if he were used to letting the world pass by unnoticed. He kept his hands folded in his lap. Cole leaned down, eyes moving deliberately over Simone's face. Her dark skin, her driver's jacket, the impeccable leather interior. "License and registration," he said flatly, as if the words themselves were a burden. He didn't greet her, didn't smile. Simone kept her voice even, careful. "Is there a problem, officer?" Cole's lips curled. "You tell me." You were doing 40 in a 30 zone. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. And you're driving a car that costs more than most folks' houses. So whose Maybach is this? Simone kept her hands in view, slowly reaching for her purse. This is my employer's vehicle. I'm his driver. She handed over her documents. Cole looked them over, making a show of reading every detail. He glanced past her, peered into the back seat at the silent passenger, but barely acknowledged him. "You got any ID, sir?" he asked the man quietly, but with a dismissive air, as if expecting nothing important. The passenger nodded, wordlessly holding up his wallet for a second, but Cole barely glanced at it before returning to Simone. The older officer, Saunders, remained by the cruiser, arms crossed. He looked at the Maybach's vanity plate, then at Simone, his face impassive. There was a certain tiredness in his eyes, the sort that comes from too many years seeing the same story play out, night after night. But he said nothing, and his presence did nothing to ease the tension. Cole rapped his knuckles on the door again, this time with more force. "You know, I don't see too many folks like you driving something like this," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Where'd you get the job? Win some kind of lottery?" Simone met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I applied. I was hired." Cole smirked. "Huh, good for you." He looked over the registration again, lips moving as he read her name. A beat passed. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of insects and a television from somewhere behind a screened window. Finally, Cole handed the papers to Sanders, who gave them a cursory glance and handed them back. Sanders's eyes lingered on Simone, thoughtful, as if he were working through something in his head. Cole wasn't finished. He circled the car, peered in each window, then leaned in to glare at Simone. "You wouldn't mind if we took a look around the car, would you?" he asked, voice all challenge. "Unless you've got something to hide." Simone felt a familiar knot in her gut. She knew she could say no. She also knew what refusing meant on a deserted street at night. She glanced at her passenger, who sat very still, his face hidden in half-shadow, giving no sign that he intended to intervene. She chose her words carefully. "If you have probable cause, officer. Otherwise, I'd rather you didn't." Cole's nostrils flared. For a second, something like anger flickered across his face, then vanished. Sanders cleared his throat. "Dennis, just check her paperwork and let's get going." Cole ignored him. He stepped closer, so near Simone could see the stubble on his chin. "People like you," he muttered, "don't usually get this far." Simone straightened her back, chin high. "Officer, I'd like to get back to my employer. Are we finished?" Cole's eyes narrowed. He hesitated, then stepped away. "Not yet." The air around the car thickened with uncertainty. Simone sensed that the night wasn't nearly over. A humid hush hung over the street as the daylight drained away, leaving only the flicker of a broken street lamp and the distant pulse of a radio drifting from a nearby porch. The air was thick with the expectation of trouble, the kind Simone Harris knew better than to dismiss. She'd lived too long on the periphery not to recognize when the night was turning against her. She kept her posture steady as Officer Dennis Cole loomed beside her, flashlight beam tracing a slow, scrutinizing path over her face, uniform, and hands. Simone had handed over her driver's license and the Maybach's registration with deliberate care, fingers moving precisely, no sudden motions, every action calculated for safety. Dennis took the cards, his brows pulling together in a shallow frown as he examined them. He flipped Simone's license over, checking for hidden marks, as if expecting to discover a forgery with one glance. His lips pressed into a thin, dissatisfied line. He glanced down at the registration, then back at Simone. "So, Simone Harris," he read aloud, voice flat and slightly mocking. "How does someone like you land a job driving a car like this?" He waved the registration for emphasis, eyes cold. "And don't tell me It's family money. Simone replied calmly. I'm employed by a private client. I have the paperwork and clearances. If you'd like to check with my employer, I can provide a contact. She kept her tone respectful, but there was steel beneath the words. Dennis's gaze slid over her shoulder to the rear seat, his tone shifting to something sharper. Who's the gentleman in the back? His voice made gentleman sound like an accusation. Simone hesitated a moment. She glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Marcus's eyes. He offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod, subtle reassurance, but not a rescue. She answered, He's my passenger this evening, sir. Dennis didn't hide his suspicion. And what's your business tonight, sir? He said, directing the question toward Marcus at last. Marcus, composed and careful, met Dennis's gaze for a brief second before responding. I'm just a passenger, he replied, his voice low and nonchalant, as if nothing about this situation warranted surprise or concern. Dennis looked him up and down, dismissive. Marcus wore a plain sports coat, no tie, nothing to betray his status. If he were anyone important, he wasn't dressed for it. Dennis gave him a final contemptuous glance, then turned his full attention back to Simone, clearly uninterested in pursuing the passenger angle. Meanwhile, Officer Greg Sanders watched from behind the open door of the cruiser, arms folded, expression unreadable. As Dennis handed him the documents for a brief inspection, Sanders's eyes lingered a beat too long on Marcus's name on the registration form. There was a flicker of something, recognition, or at least a hint of curiosity. But Sanders said nothing, letting the moment slide. Dennis stepped closer, breaking Simone's personal space, his voice turning aggressive. You got anything in this car I should know about? Drugs, weapons, open containers? I'm sure someone with a Maybach knows all the loopholes. He sneered, making no effort to mask his suspicion. Simone stood tall, meeting his glare without flinching. There is nothing illegal in this car, officer. If you want to search the vehicle, I'd prefer you explain the reason first. Dennis clicked his tongue, unimpressed by her composure. Reason is, I'm not used to seeing a setup like this. Woman like you, car like this, passenger not talking. He shook his head. Usually means someone's hiding something. Marcus shifted slightly in the back seat, but kept his eyes on the floor. He was giving Simone room, trusting her to handle this without interference, at least for now. Saunders glanced again at Marcus, this time eyes narrowing, as if a memory tugged at the back of his mind. There was something familiar about the man, but he couldn't quite place it. Still, protocol and pride kept him from speaking up. He merely handed the documents back to Dennis and continued watching, his posture rigid. Dennis snapped his gloves on with a little flourish, making a show for the empty street. All right, Miss Harris, let's see the trunk, he demanded, the order sharp as broken glass. Pop it open, now! The moment stretched, tension crackling. Simone's pulse hammered at her temples, but she refused to let fear show. With deliberate care, she moved to the driver's door and pressed the trunk release button. The soft thud of the Maybach's trunk unlatching echoed much too loudly in the still evening air. Dennis walked around to the back, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness, probing every corner before the lid was even fully up. He acted as if he expected to find a stash of weapons, a bag of drugs, something that would make the traffic stop headline news. Simone kept her chin high, eyes straight ahead, jaw tight. She could feel Marcus's silent support behind her, a presence that steadied her nerves, even as he gave no sign of intervening. Saunders hovered by the passenger side, hands fidgeting with his radio but making no call. He studied the scene, gaze shifting between Dennis, Simone, and Marcus, his brow furrowed. Something about this was off, and Sanders felt it, but the script was already running. Dennis rifled through the trunk, poking into a spare tire well, flipping through Simone's spare jacket and emergency kit. Finding nothing, he slammed the trunk shut with more force than necessary. the sound splitting the quiet. He stalked back to Simone, his face set in a scowl. "Stay right there. I'm not done." Simone stood her ground, heart hammering, refusing to show an inch of vulnerability. She knew this wasn't about the car. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about her, and the story Dennis had already written in his mind the moment he saw her behind that wheel. She waited, knowing this friction was only the beginning. The trunk of the Maybach gaped open, its plush interior now starkly exposed to the indifferent night. Simone stood by, her back straight and hands visible, as Officer Dennis Cole rummaged through her belongings with the cavalier disregard of someone certain they would find something. If not now, then eventually. He didn't bother to hide his contempt, nor the smirk that twisted his lips with every item he pulled out and held aloft in the flickering streetlight. He yanked out her tote bag, upending it onto the pavement so that its contents, a battered wallet, half-empty water bottle, a book of daily reflections, a tangle of charging cords, even a pack of cough drops, scattered across the dirty concrete. Each item felt like a tiny public exposure, a deliberate tearing away of privacy, and Simone felt the shame welling up in her throat, hot and acid. "What's all this, huh?" Dennis crowed, kicking aside the wallet with his boot as though it might bite him. "Takes a lot of junk to drive someone around town, or are you hiding something deeper in there?" He moved on to a neatly folded rain jacket, shook it out, checked the pockets, and then tossed it to the curb. "You're a real collector, aren't you?" he mocked, his tone calculated to wound. Simone kept her chin high, refusing to let the sting show. "Those are my personal effects, officer. You won't find anything illegal. I'm just a private driver doing my job." Dennis grunted, as if unconvinced. "We'll see about that." He reached deeper, prodding at the lining of the trunk, then running his hands over the spare tire compartment. Finding nothing, his frustration simmered, turning to pettiness. He pulled out her emergency kit, emptied it onto the sidewalk. A reflective vest, a small flashlight, a sealed first aid pack. "Ever have to patch up one of your VIP clients?" he sneered, as if expecting a nervous admission. "No," Simone replied simply, watching her things scattered. The dignity of her small life made a spectacle for any neighbor peeking through their blinds. From the curb, Officer Sanders watched the scene unfold. His arms remained crossed, but his jaw had tightened. There was something in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even a flicker of guilt, as he saw Dennis's rough hands make a show of every possession. Sanders wasn't new to Lakefield, nor to the script, but tonight it played out with a rawness that unsettled even him. Still, he said nothing, bound by the unspoken code not to undermine his partner in public. All the while, Marcus sat silent in the back seat, his hands folded tightly together, knuckles white. Through the open door, he watched Simone endure the indignity with quiet poise, but the creases at the corners of his eyes deepened, his mouth setting into a grim line. He couldn't intervene. Not yet. Not without risking escalation. Not without exposing his own identity, and perhaps making everything worse for Simone. Still, he felt every blow of Dennis's carelessness as if it landed on him directly. Dennis finally slammed the trunk shut with a clang that echoed down the empty block. "All right," he drawled, turning to Simone with a predator's smile. "Let's make sure you're not carrying anything else." Without warning, he reached for Simone's arm, gripping it tight. "Step over here and face the car," he ordered, guiding her toward the Maybach's side panel. His grip was harder than it needed to be, fingers digging into her flesh. Simone stiffened but did not pull away. She'd been here before, too, handled, doubted, treated as a suspect for nothing more than her presence. Dennis pressed her gently but firmly against the car, spreading her arms along the smooth metal. He leaned in close, his breath sour and hot against her ear. "Feet apart," he barked, giving her no time to protest. His hands began their search, rough and impersonal, patting down her arms, sides, pockets, even the waistband of her slacks. It was more theater than necessity, an exercise in dominance performed beneath the indifferent gaze of the street lamp. The metal was cold against Simone's cheek, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would betray her calm. Saunders looked away, jaw clenched, but still he didn't step in. Marcus's expression darkened. A muscle twitched in his jaw, but he remained still in the shadows, knowing that even a single word could tip things into chaos. Dennis finished his search, finding nothing. Still, he didn't let go of Simone's arm. No weapons, no drugs. Guess you're cleaner than you look, he muttered. The words a barb meant to stick. He released her with a little shove, as if dismissing her existence. Simone straightened, gathering what dignity she could. Her face was calm, but her body ached from the rough handling. For a split second, Marcus's eyes flashed. Outrage, frustration, something almost primal. But he reined it in, exhaling slow, eyes narrowing. He'd learned to be careful, learned how little it took for anger to be used against you. Dennis stepped back, turning to confer with Sanders, who met his gaze for the first time that night with visible discomfort. "Anything you want to add, Greg?" Dennis prompted, but Sanders shook his head slightly, lips pressed tight. Simone stood by the car, her belongings strewn and her nerves frayed, knowing that she had to outlast this moment, that more trials could still be ahead. The world had shrunk to a harsh pool of light. The Maybach caught in the blinding gaze of the patrol car, 2 officers on edge, and the neighborhood stirring with the uneasy knowledge that something was wrong. The faces at windows, black, white, brown, were lit up by the flicker of red and blue, silent witnesses to the kind of violence most people only saw on their phones. Tonight, it was right outside their homes. Simone's breath came shallow as Dennis Cole's hand, heavy and impatient, pressed her face harder into the side of the Maybach. The smooth metal was cold, her cheeks stinging from the pressure. His voice was a low growl behind her ear. "Don't try anything," he barked, giving her another shove for emphasis. Instinct told her to remain perfectly still, but the pain, the humiliation, the ache in her limbs made it impossible not to shift, just a little, to relieve the strain on her shoulder. As soon as she moved, Dennis's hand snapped tighter around her arm. With a deliberate, almost theatrical sneer, he pressed the tip of his baton hard into her side, making her gasp. Simone's voice trembled with outrage she tried to hide. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I'm asking you to act professionally." Dennis didn't hesitate. He drew back, then brought the baton down with a swift, punishing crack across her shin. The impact rang out across the block, sharp enough to make a few neighbors draw in their breath behind glass. Simone clenched her jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a scream, even as fire shot up her leg. "Shut up, you stubborn!" Dennis spat, finishing with a slur about hard-headed black trash that cut through the night like a slap. From the back seat, Marcus's knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists in his lap. He watched, unblinking, every muscle tight with the effort of restraint. For a moment, Dennis glanced into the car, meeting Marcus's eyes through the open window. "What are you looking at?" Dennis barked, lip curling with open contempt. "You're next if you keep staring." He leaned in, close enough for Marcus to smell the coffee and adrenaline on his breath. "You people think you can just sit back and watch. Think again." Marcus's voice was steady, soft, deceptively calm. "I'm only here to observe. I want to see exactly how law enforcement treats people in this town." Dennis sneered, eyes narrowing. "You want a show, old man? Don't worry. You're part of it now." Sanders, until now content to stand back, finally stepped forward, alarm on his face. "Dennis, that's enough. Back off. We're not supposed to—" But Dennis cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Stay out of it, Greg. She wants to act tough. She gets treated tough." The exchange was being watched. Overhead, a young woman stood on her balcony across the street, phone in hand, quietly recording every word and every blow. Her lips were pressed into a thin, determined line. On the ground floor, a child's face peeked from behind a curtain, eyes wide, soaking up a lesson that would linger long after the blue lights faded. Simone steadied her breath. She was shaking now, the ache in her shin threatening to unmoor her, but she held herself together. "You're hurting me," she managed, her voice quiet but firm. Dennis only grinned, twisting her wrist further behind her back. "That's the point. People like you always think the rules don't apply." He spat on the ground, then leaned down so his words were for Simone alone. "You want to get smart with me again? See where that gets you." Sanders tried once more, stepping up to Dennis's side. "Dennis, this isn't procedure. Let's just do our job by the book." But Dennis wasn't listening. His grip on Simone didn't loosen. "I've got this, Sanders. Go check on the car, unless you want her boyfriend here to start mouthing off, too." It was then that Dennis glanced at Marcus again, his eyes full of scorn. "What are you even doing in a car like this, huh? Chauffeur your girlfriend for tips?" His laughter was loud, ugly, a public humiliation. "Look at you. Can't even speak up for her. Figures." Marcus met Dennis's gaze, his face a mask of patience. But beneath it, his anger was volcanic, threatening to boil over. Still, he held back, determined to witness every word, every act, to see just how far the officers would go. This wasn't just about Simone anymore. It was about exposing the rot in Lakefield's police force. On the balcony, the young woman zoomed in with her phone, her hand shaking only slightly. She knew this footage might matter, maybe more than anything she'd seen on the news. Dennis was breathing heavily now, adrenaline making him reckless. He raised his voice so the gathering crowd, neighbors, children, the silent witness of the street, could hear. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," he shouted, snapping the handcuffs from his belt with a flourish. "One more move and you'll regret it for a long time." Simone's breath came quickly and shallowly. The fear was real, but so was her resolve. She locked eyes with Dennis, unblinking. "I'm not resisting. I just want to be treated with respect." Dennis laughed, closing the distance. "Respect? Around here you gotta earn that, and you're not even close." The metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the quiet, joining the hum of 100 cell phones, one of them still recording, immortalizing the shame, the violence, and the truth the officers thought would never leave this block. Simone staggered as Dennis shoved her, stumbling backward until her knees hit the curb. She landed awkwardly, gravel biting into her palms. The harsh glare of headlights caught the dust on her coat and the sharp lines of humiliation on her face. Around her, the block had gone almost silent, every window a pair of eyes, every porch light a stage. Marcus remained in the back seat, the Maybach's door shut, the tinted window a shield between himself and the chaos outside. Through the thick glass, he watched Simone gather herself, refusing to look defeated. His heart pounded, anger rising in his chest. But still he waited, silent, calculating, committed to seeing exactly how far this would go before he intervened. Dennis, flush with adrenaline and the power of an audience, stormed past Simone without a second glance. He yanked open the Maybach's front passenger door and shoved the seat forward, poking around the glove compartment and under the seats. He made no effort to hide his aggression, pulling out Simone's purse, rummaging through its contents with rough hands. He snatched up her wallet and, with a smirk, flicked it open, thumbing through the few bills inside. "Living big, huh?" he muttered. Then, without warning, tossed the wallet into the gutter, where it landed in a dirty puddle. Simone clenched her jaw, her body throbbing with humiliation and pain, but she refused to rise to Dennis's bait. She stayed by the curb, hands folded in her lap, each breath a test of her resolve. Dennis turned his attention to the back seat, eyes narrow, brow furrowed. "So," he drawled, Let's see who's so important they get a chauffeur. He yanked open the rear door, the light falling across Marcus's face. For the first time, Dennis looked at him. "Name?" he barked, suspicion dripping from every syllable. Marcus met his gaze, measured and calm. "Marcus Harris," he answered, voice low but firm. Dennis looked him up and down, clearly unimpressed by Marcus's composed, unflinching manner or the neat, understated clothes he wore. "And what's your business with her?" Dennis pressed, pointing back towards Simone with a jerk of his chin. "I'm a passenger," Marcus replied, tone unyielding. "She's my driver," Dennis scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah? Doesn't seem like she's doing much driving now." He leaned in closer, voice dropping. "You two got anything you want to tell me? Something you're hiding in this fancy ride?" From the curb, Simone watched Marcus, her frustration and worry reflected in his carefully controlled expression. She saw his knuckles clench on the seat, the restraint in his eyes. She also saw how Dennis was searching for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate, to punish, to make an example. Meanwhile, Sanders lingered at the open driver's door, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the lines of worry deepening around his eyes. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing from Simone, still on the ground, to Dennis, rummaging in the car, and finally to Marcus, whose features seemed vaguely familiar. Sanders frowned, mind working through the fog of memory. To buy time, Sanders spoke, voice careful but polite. "Everything okay back here, sir?" He leaned in a little, trying to get a better look at Marcus's face, searching for recognition. Marcus nodded. "I'd appreciate it if my driver's personal property were treated with more respect." Sanders blinked. That sense of familiarity nagged. Marcus's face, a face he'd seen before, though never in person, maybe on TV, maybe on a campaign poster. The thought tugged at the edge of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it yet. Dennis, oblivious, continued his one-man search party, tossing Simone's charger, loose papers, and even her sunglasses into the footwell with a derisive grunt. He turned to Sanders, waving a battered lipstick in the air. "Seriously, Greg, who keeps this much crap in their car? Only people hiding something, and that's who." Sanders didn't answer. His gaze darted from Dennis to Marcus and back again, tension pulling tight across his shoulders. The longer he looked at Marcus, the more certain he became that he'd seen that face before, above a slogan, on a glossy mailer, during last year's election. But still, he held his tongue. Dennis rounded on Simone again, his anger now searching for an outlet. "So what are you anyway? Driver? Girlfriend? Accomplice? This whole setup stinks." Simone kept her voice steady. "I'm just doing my job." From across the street, the resident on the balcony continued to film, zooming in as Dennis flung Simone's ID onto the sidewalk. The moment was being documented, every insult and every violation etched into digital memory. Sanders looked at Marcus one more time, this time seeing him. Recognition flickered in his eyes, an almost startled realization. "That's him," he thought. But before he could speak, Marcus finally broke his silence. Marcus's tone was controlled, resonant, impossible to ignore. "Officers," he said, looking from Dennis to Sanders, "I think you should follow proper procedure. There's a right way to do your job, and this isn't it." The words hung in the night, sharp as a gavel's blow. For a moment, everyone froze. The cops, Simone, even the witnesses at their windows. Sanders swallowed, nerves prickling. Dennis glared at Marcus, but there was a flicker of uncertainty now, just enough for Sanders to glance at him, questioning. The air had changed. Something in the power dynamic was shifting, even if only slightly. The scene at the curb had swelled. Flashing blue and red strobes washed over the block, illuminating clusters of neighbors who'd drifted outside, arms folded tight against the gathering dark. On the balcony, the young woman's phone remained steady, every second of the humiliation and chaos still being recorded. Voices buzzed in low whispers, nervous, scandalized, uncertain. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It was becoming a spectacle. Dennis Cole, still pumped with adrenaline, had all but forgotten protocol. He stalked from the Maybach to Simone, then back to the open passenger door, making a show of searching for contraband that everyone watching knew he'd never find. Simone, battered but unbroken, stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the performance with a kind of weary resolve. Marcus Harris sat in the back seat, his silhouette barely visible behind the half-rolled window. His calm was practiced, but beneath it, tension simmered. He watched the crowd, the officers, the glint of cell phones capturing every word. He knew the stakes had changed. Greg Sanders lingered at the open driver's door, eyes flicking between Marcus and the gathering crowd. Something about the way Marcus spoke, calm, assured, with the faintest edge of authority, kept tugging at Sanders' memory. There was an intensity to the man's gaze, a presence that demanded attention even in silence. Unable to ignore the itch any longer, Sanders stepped closer to the Maybach, his brow furrowed. He looked at Marcus, looked not as a suspect, not as just another black man in a fancy car, but with a flicker of true recognition. "Sir," Sanders said, hesitating, his voice lower now, uncertain. "Forgive me, but have we met before?" He peered through the glass, searching Marcus's eyes. Marcus met his gaze, offering only the smallest of nods. And then it clicked. The billboard, the campaign video, the victory speech on election night aired in every living room in Lakefield. The memory landed like a stone in Sanders's gut. His face went pale. He stepped back, stunned, and glanced around at the growing crowd, at the phones held aloft, the faces pressed to windows. Leaning in, he spoke quietly to Dennis, voice strained with urgency. "Dennis," he whispered, "come here a second." Dennis, annoyed, didn't turn at first. "What?" he snapped, still digging through Simone's things. Sanders stepped closer, lowering his voice further. I think that's Marcus Harris, the governor of Lakefield." Dennis let out a short, sharp laugh as if Sanders had told a joke. "You kidding? The governor? In a Maybach with some woman driving?" His tone dripped with mockery. "You think a man like that would ride around like this? Greg, you're getting jumpy." Sanders shook his head, face grave. "No, I'm serious. Look at him. Listen to how he talks. That's him. We need to be careful." But Dennis was having none of it. He looked back at Marcus with a sneer, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Governor? Nah, a real governor wouldn't be hiding in the back of a car, letting his driver take all the heat. He'd have security. He'd have a motorcade, not some black woman behind the wheel." "You've been had, Greg." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a current of curiosity and doubt. Sanders, usually stoic, was visibly unsettled now. He watched Marcus intently, torn between disbelief and the sense that he was standing on the edge of a disaster. Simone's breath caught in her chest. She looked at Marcus, searching his face for any sign of what he might do next. She saw the resolve in his eyes, the quiet, calculated confidence that had always set him apart from every other passenger she'd ever driven. Marcus, unhurried, reached into his pocket. The gesture was calm, deliberate. He withdrew his wallet and flicked it open, pulling out a government-issued identification card. The gold seal glimmered in the harsh artificial light. Without a word, Marcus extended the card toward both officers, his eyes cool and level. Dennis stared at the card, blinking. The emblem was unmistakable. Marcus R. Harris, Governor, State of Lakefield. For a moment, his bravado faltered, the sneer dying on his lips. Sanders, for his part, was speechless. His eyes darted between the card, Marcus, and the watching crowd. In an instant, the magnitude of what had just happened settled on him like a weight. But Dennis couldn't let it go. He scoffed, forcing a smirk. "Fake ID? Is that the best you've got?" He shoved the card back, voice mocking. I bet every hustler in town wishes he had one of those. You almost had me, old man." The crowd was shifting, energy rising as whispers spread. Was that the governor? Had these officers just humiliated the most powerful man in the state, and in front of half the neighborhood? Simone straightened, pain forgotten for a moment. Her hope flickered. Maybe, finally, the truth was about to change everything. Saunders could only stare, hands trembling slightly, realization written across his face. He knew there was no more doubt. He'd crossed a line tonight, and the world was watching, and Dennis, clinging to the last shreds of authority, held his ground, defiant, even as it slipped through his fingers. Within minutes, the block had transformed from a sleepy residential street to the epicenter of a gathering storm. The crowd had grown, men in work shirts, mothers in pajamas, teenagers clutching bikes, and now the first flashes of professional cameras and the eager murmurs of the press. The harsh whir of a news van pulling up cut through the buzz as reporters jogged across the grass, breathless, holding up phones, microphones, and streaming gear. Simone pressed herself upright against the Maybach, hands still trembling, face lit by a dozen smartphone screens. The pain in her leg throbbed, but the real ache was the humiliation, the sense that every injustice she'd suffered was now on display, beamed live to the world. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, searching for any sign of what would come next. Dennis, red-faced and still clutching the handcuffs, tried to position himself between the growing crowd and his two suspects. He puffed up, raising his voice over the swirl of questions from the sidewalk. "Back up! This is a police investigation. No one interferes." But it was too late for control. A young reporter in a windbreaker, microphone in hand, suddenly shouted from the edge of the crowd, voice ringing clear above the chaos. "That's him! That's Governor Marcus Harris!" She turned, waving to her camera operator. "Get a close-up! That's the governor of Lakefield!" A gasp rippled through the audience. Neighbors, curious onlookers, and now local journalists all pivoted their phones and cameras to focus on Marcus. The energy changed. Tension sharpened into a kind of electric outrage, faces lighting up in realization and disbelief. Simone felt it too. It was the split second when the story slipped out of the officer's control, when the crowd realized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The incident wasn't just about a black woman being humiliated, but about the abuse of power so blatant it could touch even the state's highest office. Dennis tried to recover, his tone shifting from bravado to defensive posturing. "No one is above the law," he declared, chest out, glancing between the governor, the cameras, and the restless mob. "We treat every citizen the same. This isn't about who you are. This is about procedure." But his voice wavered, the old confidence undermined by the buzz of phones and the presence of cameras. Sanders, face pale and hands shaking, rushed forward, stammering apologies. "Governor Harris, I'm so sorry, sir. This was a misunderstanding. A mistake. Please let me help." He reached out to help Marcus out of the car, voice trembling with panic and shame. "Please, sir, let's get you somewhere safe." Marcus ignored him, instead stepping out into the full glare of phones, lenses, and lights. He stood tall, eyes cool and jaw set, every inch the leader he was. He gave Simone a nod of solidarity, his hand briefly touching her shoulder, just enough for her to draw strength. On the far edge of the scene, the young woman with the phone was now live streaming to hundreds, soon thousands, her voice tense with emotion as she narrated what she saw. "They're hurting her. That's the governor. They beat up the governor's driver. They didn't even recognize him. This is happening right now, live, on Maple Street. Share this. Don't let them cover it up." In seconds, comments exploded across the live stream. "Is this for real? Lakefield police just made the biggest mistake of their lives. How many times does this have to happen?" News crews clustered in, the sharp, crackle of walkie-talkies announcing more official eyes on the scene. A local anchor approached, careful but direct. "Governor Harris, can you tell us what happened tonight?" Marcus didn't flinch. He faced the cameras, every word measured and clear. "What you saw was a black woman, my employee, treated with contempt and violence by officers who assumed she didn't belong. That assumption nearly cost us our safety. This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who faces this kind of injustice and isn't believed until someone with power is forced to witness it too." The crowd, so recently content to watch from the shadows, now buzzed with outrage. Simone heard people murmuring her name, some in support, others in disbelief. Dennis, still unwilling to yield, stepped between Marcus and the cameras, pointing a trembling finger. "This isn't finished. There will be a full report. We'll see what Internal Affairs says. No one is getting special treatment here. No one." But the words fell flat. The audience, the press, even Sanders, everyone could see the lines had been crossed. Some in the crowd called out, angry and insistent. "We saw what you did! We've got it on tape!" Simone's heart raced, no longer with fear, but with a wild, shaky hope. Sanders retreated, wiping sweat from his brow. The reporters pressed in closer, their questions relentless. "Were you aware who you were detaining, Officer Cole? Why was excessive force used? Governor Harris, do you intend to file charges?" Above the chaos, police radios crackled with new urgency. At Lakefield PD headquarters, the chief had just received a frantic call. His officers were being live-streamed, broadcast to tens of thousands, caught on video assaulting the governor's driver and disrespecting the governor himself. Squad cars with sirens blaring were already on the way, the city's fragile image on the line. By dawn, the world had changed for everyone involved. What began as a routine stop in a quiet neighborhood had detonated across America, thrusting Lakefield into the harshest glare of the digital spotlight. The video, a shaky, heart-pounding stream of Simone's humiliation and Marcus's unmasking, spread with breathtaking speed. Hashtags multiplied by the hour. Justice for Simone surged to the top of national trends, while clips of Dennis's slurs and the violence replayed in endless loops across every device in the country. In the governor's office, Marcus Harris sat behind a battered oak desk, the line of his jaw tense as his phone vibrated with a fresh barrage of notifications. News anchors dissected every frame of the footage. Editorials called for reform. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist the story. A governor brutalized and a black woman nearly destroyed on her street by men sworn to protect. Simone, meanwhile, sat at the opposite end of the table, her face still marked by bruises but her eyes unbroken. She was surrounded by staffers and advocates, offers of legal help and public support arriving by the minute. For the first time in her life, she was both witness and symbol, no longer invisible, but the face of a movement that had caught fire overnight. Outside the office, the streets of Lakefield were unrecognizable. Protesters filled every intersection, their signs held high. "End police brutality. Black Lives Matter. We see you, Simone." Chants echoed through the city, blending anger and hope into a single voice that would not be ignored. Social media became both amplifier and megaphone, with citizens sharing their own stories, their own encounters, their own demands for justice. It was as if the entire state had woken up. Inside the Lakefield Police Department, chaos reigned. Dennis Cole, who only hours before had ruled the roadside with arrogance, now sat in a sterile interview room, stripped of badge and weapon. He watched as a supervisor slid a suspension notice across the table, the words, "Pending investigation for use of excessive force," in bold at the top. Dennis's face was flushed with anger, but also a dawning fear. The world he had known was slipping away minute by minute. Greg Sanders, his partner, was next, but his interview was different. Not just about what he did, but about what he failed to do. Supervisors peppered him with questions. Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you call for backup sooner? Didn't you realize who Marcus Harris was? Every answer hung in the air like a verdict. The city's leadership scrambled to respond. The mayor called for calm, flanked by activists and local clergy. The police chief, sweat staining his collar, promised swift and transparent investigation. But nothing could stop the rising tide. Hashtags became banners. Live streams became headlines. Simone's story became a call to arms. Not even politicians could ignore it. Marcus's political opponents, many of them frequent critics, were forced to pick a side. Some condemned the officers outright, calling for their firing and prosecution. Others hedged, blaming a few bad apples, while insisting Lakefield's police were mostly good men and women. In every case, the story grew larger, a referendum on power, prejudice, and the soul of the community. Inside his office, Marcus made the call. He summoned his communications director, his attorneys, and Simone herself. "We're not hiding," he said, his tone steady but urgent. "We're not letting this be swept under the rug. We're holding a press conference at noon. Simone, I want you there. If you're willing, I'd like you to speak as well." For a moment, Simone hesitated. She'd always been private. Her struggles, her past, her victories, and scars. But now, the fight was bigger than her pain. She nodded, her voice strong. "I want to tell the truth, not just for me, for everyone who can't." Word spread fast. Reporters crowded the steps of the State House, cameras ready. By noon, Simone and Marcus stood side by side at the podium, the world watching. Marcus addressed the crowd first, every sentence a deliberate strike against the rot he'd witnessed. "What happened to me and Simone was not an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of something that's poisoned this country for too long. This is about every black citizen who's ever been told they don't belong, every family threatened by those who should protect. We demand a full, independent investigation. We demand change." Then Simone stepped up, her voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "I was afraid I'd never be believed. I was afraid to speak, afraid to hope. But after last night, I know I'm not alone. I know you saw what happened. I know you care. I'm here because we all deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter who's watching, no matter where we come from." The press conference was streamed live, translated, clipped, and shared by millions. For many, Simone's quiet strength became the enduring image of a night that would reshape Lakefield and possibly the country. That same afternoon, Lakefield PD received an official order from the Department of the Interior. Federal investigators were on their way. The entire department, every file, every body cam, every report would be subject to full review. Dennis's suspension was immediate. Sanders was placed on administrative leave pending his hearing. The winds of accountability, long absent, had finally come to town, and through it all, justice for Simone kept rising. One name, one night, one act of defiance sparking a wave too strong to ignore. Inside the Lakefield Police Department, the walls seemed to close in. The world outside was ablaze with protest and scrutiny, but within the squad room, the mood was darker, charged with resentment and fear. Officers clustered in tight knots, voices low, as if the wrong word might tip the entire place into chaos. Greg Sanders sat stiffly in a small conference room, flanked by two internal affairs investigators and the department's deputy chief. The air was stale, thick with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing the city was watching and that every word might end a career. "Officer Sanders, do you understand why you're here today?" The lead investigator's tone was clipped, businesslike. Sanders nodded, rubbing his palm against his thigh beneath the table. "I failed to intervene," he said quietly. I should have stopped it. I let it go too far. The deputy chief pressed, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. You witnessed a use of force that was excessive. Why didn't you step in? Sanders hesitated. The truth ached behind his tongue. Fear of breaking rank warred with his conscience. Dennis, Officer Cole, was out of control. I didn't want to escalate things with the crowd there, but I know that's not an excuse. I should have stopped him. I was wrong. A heavy silence followed. The investigators scribbled notes, faces unreadable. One of them finally looked up. Are you aware that your actions, or inactions, have made you the subject of a federal review? Sanders closed his eyes. I know. Down the hall, Dennis Cole paced a separate interview room, sweat beading at his temples. He faced another set of investigators, this time more severe. 2 from Internal Affairs, 1 in plain clothes from the mayor's office, and a state prosecutor with a legal pad open in front of him. I followed protocol, Dennis insisted, his voice hard. That woman was acting suspicious. She mouthed off. She refused to cooperate. I did what was necessary to protect myself and my partner. The lead investigator eyed him coolly. You struck an unarmed woman with a baton. You used racial slurs on a public street. Do you think that's justified? Dennis bristled. She resisted. You've all seen how these situations go. Sometimes you have to put people in their place. Look, she brought it on herself. She was hiding something. You have no evidence of that, the investigator shot back. And your partner says otherwise. Dennis's face darkened. Sanders is just covering his ass. Word of the investigation spread quickly through the department. Old alliances frayed. Some officers, especially younger ones, quietly condemned Dennis, muttering about ruining it for everyone and making us all look bad. Others, older, set in their ways, defended him loudly, arguing that people don't know what it's like on the street and that politicians always throw us under the bus. The break room became a war zone of whispered arguments. Some spoke up. He went too far. That could have been any of us getting filmed. Others bit back. We stick together. You don't rat out your own, no matter what. If Dennis goes down, we all could. Amid the turmoil, department leadership was on edge. The police chief met privately with city officials. His voice strained as he promised transparency, but his eyes darted to every corner, fearing leaks and sabotage from within. Meanwhile, the investigation took a turn. One of the Internal Affairs officers, combing through old body cam files and departmental audio logs, stumbled upon a series of disturbing recordings. In the scratchy background, Dennis's voice was unmistakable, caught on tape, berating black civilians, using slurs, and threatening force during traffic stops that had never made it into official reports. The discovery sent a shockwave through the department, evidence of a pattern, not just a single incident. It couldn't be buried, not now. The recordings were forwarded to the mayor's office and to the federal investigators already descending on Lakefield. The FBI, already monitoring the case, was officially invited in. The stakes had jumped. What began as a single viral incident had become a full-scale probe into the culture and conduct of the Lakefield PD. Sanders sat in his car after the interview, hands trembling on the steering wheel. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, asking himself whether the badge he wore was still worth the silence it demanded. In another room, Dennis slammed his fist against the table, cursing the rats and traitors he blamed for his fall. But out in the city, as protesters filled the squares and news cameras documented every new revelation, the pressure was building, not just for answers, but for a reckoning that could not be contained. The arrival of the FBI felt less like a step in the investigation and more like the start of a reckoning. Black SUVs lined up outside the Lakefield Police Headquarters and the city's historic Stonewall Town Hall, their engines humming quietly as a team of federal agents, crisp and unflinching, swept through doors with briefcases and secure laptops. They made no small talk, no gestures of comfort. Every officer in Lakefield knew what that silence meant. This was no longer a local scandal. They were under the cold, national microscope. Dennis Cole sat alone in a windowless federal interview room, his hands cuffed to the table. Across from him, 2 FBI agents clicked recorders on, their faces expressionless. To Dennis's left, a lawyer, hired at the last minute by the union, scanned the stack of evidence with growing alarm. "Mr. Cole," the lead agent began, "we are conducting a full review of your service record and your actions on the night in question. You are advised that your statements are under federal investigation." Dennis tried to regain his bravado, shifting in his seat. "This is a witch hunt. I did what I had to do. She resisted. I protected myself." The second agent slid a printed list across the table, a litany of complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, all previously buried or dismissed by departmental reviews. Alongside each complaint was a corresponding date, witness, and summary. Dennis's mouth tightened as he scanned the pages, his confidence draining with each new line. The agents pressed on, playing segments from the newly uncovered audio files. Dennis's voice, rough and unmistakable, barked slurs and threats during routine stops. It was damning, undeniable, a pattern laid bare for the first time, the blue wall now full of cracks. Meanwhile, Sanders was called in separately. He faced the agents with shoulders hunched, the shame of inaction etched in every line of his face. "I let it happen," he admitted quietly. "He went too far, and I didn't stop it. I'm ready to testify to that." The FBI's net grew wider. Agents interviewed Simone in a secure room, recording her statement in detail, corroborated by multiple witnesses and the infamous viral video. Marcus Harris, called to the town hall under heavy security, was asked not only about the night in question, but also about systemic issues he'd observed as governor. His answers were measured, thorough, evidence of a leader who'd seen the same story in different forms for years. In the bowels of the police department, the FBI team pored over years of case files and personnel records. They found a paper trail, community complaints never investigated, body cam footage never reviewed, officers shielded from discipline by a culture of silence. In Dennis's folder, the sheer number of incidents, always dismissed, always explained away, became irrefutable proof of a department in crisis. That night, the town's airwaves were ablaze. Local and national news covered the investigation's explosive revelations. A split-screen image of Dennis's angry face and Simone's battered dignity played again and again, anchoring the city's shame in every living room. People saw, some for the first time, the true face of what had been hidden. But the moment that truly shifted the conversation came live, in front of a sea of cameras. Marcus Harris, invited onto national television for a special broadcast, stood alone at the podium. His voice was clear and resonant, sorrow and anger balanced with hope. "This isn't about one officer or one night," he declared, his words echoing in homes across the state. "This is about a system that has failed its citizens, failed its oath, failed its soul. It's time to rebuild, not just to punish, but to reform from the ground up. Lakefield must become a model for the future, a place where justice, not power, determines how the law is enforced." He called for sweeping changes: independent civilian review boards, body cam transparency, better officer training, and an end to qualified immunity for those found guilty of abuse. "We cannot heal what we refuse to see," he said, "and we cannot forgive what we refuse to fix." Simone, watching from home, felt a mix of pain and pride. She'd become a symbol, but the fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who'd been silenced and sidelined for too long. Across Lakefield, protests surged again. What started as anger had become resolve. People of every background marched together, chanting for change. The hashtag Justice for Simone now stood alongside new ones. Reform Lakefield. Accountability now. City after city across the state saw rallies, sit-ins, candlelight vigils, even spontaneous town halls where neighbors spoke their truths at last. The FBI's investigation was only the beginning. The question now wasn't whether the system would change. It was how far and how fast. The storm moved from the streets into the halls of power. At the imposing marble building of the Lakefield State Capitol, urgency gripped every corridor. Lawmakers and aides hurried through wide, echoing halls, clutching folders thick with talking points and amendments. Outside, crowds pressed against barricades, their chants for justice muffled but relentless, filtering in through the old stained glass windows. Inside, a special session of the state legislature had been called, an emergency response to the uproar sweeping Lakefield and beyond. The agenda was singular: comprehensive police reform. At the front of the grand chamber, Marcus Harris took his seat, flanked by advisers and grim-faced party leaders. On the agenda were sweeping proposals: independent oversight commissions, mandatory body cams, and stricter discipline for officers with records of abuse. Simone sat quietly in the visitors' gallery, her presence both a challenge and a comfort to those below. For days, she'd been the face of change, her ordeal fueling both hope and bitter controversy. The debate was fierce from the outset. Conservative lawmakers, their voices clipped with indignation, accused Marcus of playing politics, of using the tragedy to boost his national profile. "What we're seeing is nothing but grandstanding," declared Senator Clayton Reed, a silver-haired veteran of statehouse brawls. "Our officers risk their lives daily. They deserve support, not witch hunts and media circuses." On the other side, progressive legislators held up Simone as living evidence of a broken system. "How many more Simones must suffer before we act?" demanded Representative Tanya Miller, her voice trembling. "We owe our constituents a government that values their dignity and safety over outdated loyalties." The room crackled with tension as lawmakers sparred. Statistical reports, impassioned speeches, and personal attacks flying across the chamber. In the gallery, Simone's hands were folded tightly, her bruises still fading, but her resolve stronger than ever. Midway through the heated debate, a hush fell over the room. Marcus rose and called for order. "You've heard the statistics. You've read the reports. Now it's time to hear from someone who lived through what these numbers can't capture." All eyes turned as Simone was invited to the witness stand. The chamber stilled as she stepped forward, her quiet presence commanding more respect than the loudest senator. Simone adjusted the microphone, meeting the gaze of dozens of lawmakers, some supportive, some skeptical, some visibly uncomfortable. She began softly, her voice gaining strength as she described every detail of that night: the flashing lights, the icy fear when Dennis's baton struck her leg, the sting of humiliation as her belongings were scattered on the street. She described Marcus's silent witness, the cold calculation of Sanders, and the way the crowd watched, a city holding its breath. Her words cut through the politics, forcing senators to confront the human toll of policies debated in the abstract. "For a moment," Simone said, "I thought I was alone, that no one would believe what happened to me, but the world saw, and now I'm here, so you have to see too." As she spoke, the chamber changed. A handful of senators, hardened by years of partisan battles, grew quiet, their eyes shining. One white conservative, Senator Paul Avery, shifted in his seat, wiping away a tear. He had begun the day a skeptic, dismissing the reform bill as hysteria. Now he found himself listening. The air was thick with emotion as Simone finished. Her last words, voice unsteady but unwavering, You have the power to make sure what happened to me never happens again. Please, don't waste it." The moment lingered. Lawmakers, aides, even journalists paused, uncertain how to fill the silence. Senator Avery, his voice rough with emotion, finally stood. "I came here today thinking this was a sideshow," he admitted, his words echoing in the marble chamber. "But what I heard wasn't politics. It was the truth, and it's time we stop pretending otherwise." A gasp ran through the room. Marcus met Simone's eyes with a nod. The chamber was no longer just a battleground. It was a place where hearts could change. With the gallery watching, the Speaker of the House called for the historic vote. For the first time, the old walls of Lakefield's legislature seemed ready to yield to the new. The historic chamber of the Lakefield state capitol felt like the center of the world. The marble walls, long witnesses to political posturing and empty speeches, now trembled with something different, real consequence. Across the state and far beyond, millions tuned in as the final vote on police reform approached, their hopes and fears condensed into a few tense minutes. Rows of lawmakers sat on edge, faces illuminated by the blue glow of television cameras. Journalists filled every balcony, their cameras capturing every detail. Downstairs, Simone sat in a reserved seat, hands knotted in her lap, her phone already vibrating with messages from supporters she'd never met. Marcus was front and center among the bill's sponsors, posture unyielding, his gaze fixed on the speaker's gavel. As the speaker called the chamber to order, a hush fell. The reform bill, months in the making, fueled by outrage, heartbreak, and Simone's courage, stood on a knife's edge. Opponents looked grim, arms crossed. Supporters leaned forward, barely breathing. The vote began. Each name called echoed across the marble like a drumbeat. No. The tally crept up, neck and neck, each swing of support or opposition enough to raise or dash hope. Simone's heart raced as the final names were read. It came down to a single vote, a razor-thin margin that no one could have predicted. At last, the speaker announced the result. The bill had passed by only 2 votes. Cheers erupted from the progressive side of the chamber, while sighs and a few muttered curses rose from the opposition. Reporters scrambled for their phones, already tweeting out the news that Lakefield had made history. The applause faded as the speaker invited statements from the floor. Sanders stood, shoulders squared, voice trembling but resolute. The entire chamber turned to him. The man who had failed to act but now stood before them not as a bystander, but as someone who understood the price of silence. "I was there that night," Sanders began, "and I made the worst mistake of my career. I let fear and loyalty stop me from doing what was right. For that, I am truly sorry. To Simone, to the people of Lakefield, and to every officer who wears this badge in good faith. Let this vote mark a new beginning, not just for our state, but for every officer who must choose between silence and justice." There was a hush, then the faintest ripple of applause. Even some of Sanders' critics nodded, his admission a small but crucial act of repair. Not everyone was ready for this reckoning. From the public gallery, Dennis Cole, now infamous, watched with clenched fists. When Sanders finished, Dennis rose, his face red with fury, and slammed his fist against the balcony rail. "This is a joke! You're all turning your backs on the real police!" His voice cut through the chamber, but was met with a cascade of boos and jeers. Security moved quickly, escorting Dennis out as he shouted insults, but his rage was drowned by the crowd's roar. Simone felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain or fear, but from a deep, overwhelming relief. She glanced down at her phone. It had already exploded with thousands of notifications. Messages poured in from across the country. Survivors, activists, mothers, and students all reaching out. You gave us hope. Thank you for speaking up. Because of you, my daughter will grow up in a better place." The words blurred together, a chorus of gratitude, solidarity, and belief. In the chamber, Marcus rose for a final statement. "Let the record show that Lakefield has chosen courage over comfort, action over denial. But our work isn't finished. True reform takes more than laws. It requires a change of heart, a new kind of vigilance, and a commitment to protect every citizen's dignity. May tonight be remembered not as the end of a crisis, but as the start of a new chapter." Outside, as news of the vote swept across the state, celebrations erupted in the streets. Protesters wept and embraced. Cars honked in solidarity. For the first time in memory, the steps of the Capitol belonged not to politicians, but to the people who demanded change and finally saw it realized. And as the night deepened, one truth was clear: the entire policing system of Lakefield, and soon the state, was about to be transformed. A new era had begun, built on the courage of those who refused to stay silent. Sunlight spilled across the newly renovated halls of the Lakefield Police Department. The old banners and plaques had been removed, replaced with symbols of transparency, unity, and a simple but powerful new motto: dignity for all. Reporters milled outside the entrance as a cohort of recruits, diverse in age, background, and ambition, filed into the training auditorium for the first session under the state's historic new reforms. Greg Sanders stood at the front of the room, his uniform crisp, but his bearing humbler than before. Appointed as a supervisor in the sweeping overhaul, he had accepted his second chance, not as redemption, but as a responsibility. This was no longer the job he'd once known. The blue wall was gone, replaced by glass, clear, fragile, and meant to let the world see everything. "Welcome," Sanders began, his voice steady. "Today isn't just about learning procedures. It's about rebuilding trust with each other, with the people we serve, and most of all, with our conscience." The recruits listened, some wary, others eager, all aware that the world was watching their every move. The trauma of the past months lingered, but so did a sense of possibility. In the front row sat Simone, invited as a keynote speaker. The scars on her leg had faded, but her presence, her calm defiance, reminded everyone that justice was not abstract. When Sanders finished his welcome, he turned the podium over to Simone. Cameras clicked, pens poised. She stood in front of a sea of new faces, not as a victim, but as a living testament to change. "I never wanted to be here," Simone began, her voice clear. "Not as a name in a hashtag, not as a symbol for someone else's cause. But when I was knocked down, I realized the fight wasn't just for me. It was for every person who's ever been told they don't belong, for every voice ignored, for every life cut short because of a badge, a bias, or a careless decision." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting when you know you're afraid. Each of you has the power to decide, every day, what kind of officer, what kind of human being you want to be." The room was silent, the gravity of her words settling on every heart. One young recruit, a Latino woman named Marisa, raised her hand. "How do we make sure this never happens again?" she asked. Simone smiled, her eyes shining with conviction. "You call it out every time. You hold each other accountable. You protect the vulnerable, even when no one is watching. You remember that silence is complicity, and courage is contagious." Her answer sparked something. Another recruit, a black man named Isaiah, stood up. "I won't let my badge be an excuse to ignore my conscience. If I see something wrong, I'll speak out, even if it means standing alone." Sanders nodded. "That's the spirit we need, not just here, but everywhere." As the session ended, local reporters interviewed recruits, documenting the birth of a new culture. news outlets across the state ran stories on Lakefield's transformation. Students at the local college held a town hall with the department. Clergy and activists organized trust walks through neighborhoods previously scarred by fear. For the first time, Lakefield's police were being seen not as occupiers, but as neighbors. Soon, the story traveled far beyond the city. A delegation from a neighboring state visited to study the Lakefield model. Editorials called for national adoption. Simone was invited to speak at the upcoming National Justice Conference, her story now a blueprint for hope. In her closing remarks to the recruits, Simone said, "This isn't the end. Real change is slow and it's hard, but it starts with a choice, your choice. Every day, you get to decide what side of history you're on. I hope you'll be proud of your answer." As the crowd rose in applause, Sanders met Simone's eyes, an unspoken promise passing between them. From tragedy, they had built a foundation for something better. Lakefield, once the symbol of everything broken, had become a beacon. Outside, the city moved with a new kind of energy, tense, uncertain, but alive with possibility. The work was far from over, but for the first time in memory, it truly felt like a new day. The Grand Hall in Washington, D.C., was awash in light and anticipation. The annual National Justice Conference, long a forum for legal minds and politicians, now buzzed with a new electricity, a sense that the moment belonged to those who had once been pushed to the margins. Flags from every state hung overhead, and representatives, advocates, and leaders filled the seats. Cameras from every major network beamed the proceedings into homes and newsrooms across America and around the globe. Simone stood backstage, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Across the city, her name had become synonymous with courage and change, but she felt none of the detachment of celebrity, only a deep, solemn responsibility. Marcus, standing a few feet away, caught her eye and gave an encouraging nod. A hush swept through the auditorium as the master of ceremonies took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce a woman whose voice turned pain into progress. Please welcome Simone Harris." As Simone walked to the podium, applause thundered, and some delegates rose to their feet. The lights were blinding, but she looked past them, focusing on the faces, some tearful, some hopeful, all listening. Her words were simple, but they cut through the grandeur of the moment. "I stand before you as a survivor, but more importantly, as a believer in what America can become. My story is not unique. For too long, people like me have been told to wait, to be quiet, to accept injustice as the price of belonging. But I am here to say, enough." She spoke of Lakefield, not as a tragedy, but as proof that communities can change. "I won't tell you it was easy. Change never is. We lost trust. We lost lives. We lost faith in the systems meant to protect us. But we found something else, each other, and with that, we built something better." As she spoke, cameras panned to Marcus, then to the president, who watched with an expression of grave attention. Simone continued, her voice rising. "If Lakefield can transform, so can any city, so can any state. But it takes more than laws. It takes courage, honesty, and a willingness to listen to the voices we've tried to silence for too long." There was a long pause as she finished, and then the hall erupted in applause, longer, deeper, more genuine than the ritual clapping of politics. On social media, her speech began trending instantly. Editorials were already calling it the Lakefield Address, and international broadcasters ran segments on the American experiment in justice reform. The president took the podium next. He paused before speaking, the gravity of the occasion visible on his face. "In Simone Harris, in Lakefield, we see the best of America. Pain confronted, wounds acknowledged, hope reclaimed. I pledge today that my administration will support national police reform modeled on Lakefield's principles. We will not turn away from hard truths, and we will invest in the courage of communities willing to change. Reporters fired off questions, asking about funding, timelines, and accountability. The president responded, "Real reform is not a slogan. It is a promise. Lakefield has shown us the way forward." By the end of the conference, delegates from more than a dozen states had already signed pledges to study and adopt versions of the Lakefield model. News tickers ran with headlines. States pledged to follow Lakefield's lead. National momentum for police reform builds. That night, Simone and Marcus sat together for a few quiet moments, watching the replay of her speech on a hotel television. Marcus looked at her with pride. "You gave them hope they didn't know they had," he said softly. "You changed something bigger than a law." Simone smiled, the exhaustion in her eyes mingling with a sense of quiet victory. "We did it together, but tomorrow, the real work continues." Across the country, communities gathered in town halls and auditoriums to discuss the Lakefield reforms. Social media overflowed with messages of support and commitment. In international capitals, American embassies fielded questions from foreign journalists curious about the Lakefield spirit. And back home, Lakefield prepared for a celebration never before seen in its history. A multiracial, multicultural festival, born from pain, transformed into a new kind of pride. The heart of Lakefield beat with a new energy as the city prepared for its first-ever Unity Festival. Sunlight bathed the central square, now adorned with bright banners and stalls representing every neighborhood, faith, and heritage. Food trucks and musicians, dancers and artists, all mingled together in a celebration of difference, of wounds not hidden, but carried into the open, where they could begin to heal. Simone walked through the crowd, overwhelmed by the warmth of smiles and embraces. Her story had been told and retold, but here, among her neighbors, it became something different, shared, not spotlighted. Parents introduced their children to her, saying quietly, "This is the woman who helped change everything." Young people snapped selfies, hugging her and tagging them with Lakefield Strong. Simone felt her pain lessen with every step. On a stage at the center of the square, Marcus took the microphone to a sea of applause. "Today," he declared, "is not just a celebration, but a commitment. We are here to honor truth, courage, and the power of a community that chose hope over fear." The crowd quieted as Sanders stepped forward. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with every word. "For years, I wore this badge with pride, but there were moments, too many, when I failed to live up to what it meant. I failed Simone. I failed all of you. I cannot erase my mistakes, but I can promise this. I will spend the rest of my career earning your trust, not demanding it." A ripple of applause and murmurs of forgiveness swept the crowd. The moment grew even more poignant as people from across Lakefield began sharing their stories. One by one, they stepped forward. A teenage boy who had been stopped and searched for walking in the wrong place. A mother whose son had once been arrested without cause. An elder who had witnessed racism all her life. Some voices shook with anger, others with grief, but the act of telling was itself a kind of release. A local pastor, microphone in hand, spoke about forgiveness. "We are not defined by what we suffer, but by what we do next. Today we forgive, not to forget, but to heal and move forward as one." Simone was called to the stage to receive the city's first Medal of Justice. Marcus presented it, his words echoing across the square. "Simone, you showed us that justice is not a destination, but a daily choice. You spoke truth to power, and you never stopped believing in this community. For that, you are Lakefield's heart." Tears welled in Simone's eyes as she accepted the medal, not for herself, but for everyone whose pain had been ignored. She looked out at the crowd and said, I accept this on behalf of every voice that was ever silenced. May we keep lifting each other, because our justice is never finished." As music and laughter filled the air, Marcus returned to the stage with a final announcement. "We know the wounds of the past are deep. That's why I am proud to launch the Lakefield Victim Support Fund, a program to help anyone harmed by racial violence, providing resources, counseling, and legal aid to rebuild lives. We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure no one has to walk this road alone again." Applause thundered across the square. Representatives from human rights groups and local organizations pledged their support. Even skeptics, those who once doubted change was possible, found themselves swept up in the new spirit of hope. But as dusk settled over Lakefield, another truth lingered in every conversation. The fight for justice was not over. The next day, the city would turn its eyes to the courthouse, where Dennis Cole would finally stand trial. His fate and the nation's response would test everything Lakefield had worked for. Simone left the square that night with her heart lighter, but her resolve intact. Lakefield was healing, but the story was far from finished. Lakefield's courthouse had never seen such a day. From before dawn, crowds lined the steps and spilled into the square, holding handmade signs. "Justice for all. End the silence. Never again." Reporters from national and international outlets gathered alongside residents, their cameras trained on the stately brick facade and the throngs outside. Every TV channel in the state, and many across the country, aired live coverage. The trial of Dennis Cole was not just a local event. It had become a symbol of America's search for accountability. Inside, the courtroom was tense with expectation. Simone sat near the front, flanked by Marcus and a few old friends. Her presence lent a quiet gravity, as did the rows of others who had come to testify. Victims, activists, and even former officers, each bearing their scars. Dennis entered, no longer the brash enforcer he once was. In the harsh light of the courtroom, his face was pale and drawn. His attorney, grim-faced, clutched a thick folder of legal briefs. As Dennis took his seat at the defense table, a hush settled over the room. The prosecution called its first witnesses. One after another, former victims of Dennis's brutality described their encounters. Traffic stops that turned violent, words that wounded deeper than any bruise. Families left terrified and humiliated. Their testimony was raw, sometimes trembling but unwavering. "He told me I'd never be believed," one man said, "but I'm here now, and so are all these people." Simone was called to the stand. Cameras flashed as she took her oath. Her voice was steady. She recounted every detail, the way Dennis's words stung, the pain as he pressed her against the car, the fear that nothing would ever change. "I stand here not just for myself," she said, "but for everyone who was ever told their pain didn't matter." Dennis's lawyer tried to discredit her, raising questions about her past, about why she'd been driving that night. But the facts spoke for themselves, and the jury's eyes rarely left Simone's face. The defense put Dennis on the stand. He claimed he'd only ever acted out of duty and fear, painting himself as a man pressured by a dangerous world. "Every day I tried to keep people safe. I was only doing my job," he insisted, his voice cracking under the strain. But then came the evidence: body cam recordings, internal memos, complaints long ignored, each played for the jury. Each word and image a hammer blow against the story Dennis tried to tell. The video of Simone's arrest was shown in full. Her pleas, Dennis's slurs, the unnecessary violence. The courtroom was silent except for the audio from the tape, and then for the quiet tears from those watching. One after another, more witnesses stepped forward. Even former colleagues, officers who had once kept silent, testified about the culture of fear, the pressure to protect their own, and the cost of breaking the code. The dam had broken. Truth, long buried, flooded the room. Outside, crowds watched every moment on giant screens. The mood was tense but determined. Chants of "justice now" and "say their names" punctuated every break in proceedings. When the closing arguments finished, the jury withdrew to deliberate. It took only hours, less time than anyone expected. When they returned, the judge called for silence. "On all counts," the verdict read, "guilty." A surge of relief swept the courtroom. Simone closed her eyes, letting out a breath she'd been holding for years. Dennis stared straight ahead, shoulders slumped, as the judge announced a severe sentence: years in prison, stripped of his badge and no chance of parole. His lawyer tried to protest, but was overruled. The message was clear. The old ways of hiding behind a badge were over. Media outlets immediately flashed the news. Simone's courage was hailed in editorials, her photo beaming from screens and front pages. Marcus, standing with her, said to the press, "Justice was not vengeance today. It was the beginning of our healing." Lakefield announced a new tradition in the verdict's wake, a day of remembrance for victims of police violence, to be held every year. Plans began for a memorial in the central square. Community leaders vowed to ensure the lessons of the past would not fade. As Simone left the courthouse, the crowd parted to let her pass. Hands reached out, some to thank, some to hug, some just to touch a symbol of hope come to life. She smiled, exhausted but undefeated. That night, Lakefield glowed with candlelight vigils and quiet prayers, not just for justice delivered, but for the long journey ahead. Reckoning had come, and now the work of true healing could begin. The grand opening of the Lakefield Museum of Justice felt less like an event and more like a new chapter for the city, one written with every step that brought Lakefield from division to hope. Even before dawn, people gathered in the central plaza, many clutching hand-drawn signs or homemade flags. Gospel choirs were warming their voices, children in matching Lakefield Strong shirts, food vendors passing out free pastries as a small thank you for the peace that had finally settled over the city. Sunlight poured through the museum's soaring glass front, illuminating a space both sacred and bustling. On one wall were portraits of Lakefield's heroes and victims, faces from the earliest days of protest to the most recent calls for reform. Opposite stood a battered Maybach key, encased in glass, and beside it, the infamous police badge once worn by a man now remembered for more than his mistakes. Simone stood just inside the door, her medal of justice gleaming, but her smile modest. She shook hands with teachers leading wide-eyed children, greeted elders who came in wheelchairs and walkers, and offered hugs to neighbors she hadn't seen in years. Marcus was never far from her side, welcoming old friends and new faces, sharing laughs and sometimes tears, as visitors recounted what the struggle for justice had meant to them. There was a palpable feeling of relief. This day was proof that Lakefield's story could be more than its wounds. The opening ceremony in the sunlit atrium was both joyful and solemn. Sanders, who'd once embodied the hard edges of the old Lakefield, was called to the stage. Instead of old bravado, he spoke with humility as he accepted a medal, not for heroism in the line of fire, but for the more difficult journey, facing his failures, leading reform, and choosing growth over pride. "I once believed my job was to uphold the law," he told the silent crowd. "Now I know it is to uphold justice. Thank you for teaching me the difference." The applause that followed was forgiving, redemptive, and many in the audience were moved to tears. Then it was Simone's turn to speak. Her voice filled the atrium, strong but laced with the memory of pain. "This building is more than glass and steel," she said. "It's a promise that we will never forget and never stop growing. Justice is not something we inherit. It's something we fight for together every day." She described the terror and loneliness of her darkest moments, but also the power of a community refusing to abandon its own. "Forgiveness is not letting go of the past," Simone said. "It's choosing to build something new, so the pain never has to be repeated." The audience rose in a standing ovation, and for a moment, hope was almost tangible, a living thing in the air. Simone's words weren't about erasing pain, but about what could be made from it. After the ceremony, the museum came alive. School children wandered through the halls, studying protest signs and courtroom sketches, pausing before the Maybach key or the photo of Simone on the witness stand. Some asked practical questions about the displays, and others wanted to know how it felt to be brave or to forgive. Simone, Marcus, and Sanders walked quietly among them, answering what they could and listening to dreams for the future. One moment lingered above the rest. In a corner gallery, a little white girl raised her hand as the class clustered around Simone. "Why did the police hurt you, Miss Simone?" she asked. The room went quiet. Simone knelt to the child's level, honest but gentle. "A long time ago, some people were so afraid of what they didn't understand, they forgot to see each other as neighbors. But now we've learned that love is stronger than fear. That's why we tell our stories and stand together, so no one ever gets hurt like that again." The girl nodded, absorbing a lesson that would ripple out into her life. Teachers looked on, some with tears in their eyes. Parents texted photos to relatives who'd left Lakefield saying, "You wouldn't believe it, it's finally happening." Elders reminisced about the darkest days and found, in the laughter of children, a kind of healing. Simone stayed for hours, answering questions about everything from what scared her most to what gave her hope. She never claimed to be fearless, but always returned to the same truth. None of us stood alone. That's how we made it through. All across Lakefield, the legacy grew. Schools scheduled assemblies on justice, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Simone and Marcus visited classrooms, sharing stories, but mostly listening. Sanders led workshops with police and high schoolers, describing how hard, but how necessary, it was to admit mistakes and to stand up, even when afraid. The story was no longer a headline, but a living, daily conversation. As the afternoon turned to evening, the museum filled with soft light and quiet talk. Marcus walked through the crowd with his grandson. Sanders explained forgiveness to a group of teens. Teachers and parents swapped ideas for new lessons. On the walls, a mural designed by Lakefield's youth depicted neighbors holding hands, raising lanterns to illuminate a dark street, an image of a community determined not to return to silence or division. On her way out, Simone watched as a teacher led her students into the sunset, each child carrying a pamphlet, each a possible torchbearer. She felt a bittersweet pride. The fight for justice would never be truly finished, but today it had been passed on. That night, Lakefield's story traveled far. News outlets published essays about the city's transformation. Social media buzzed with pictures of kids grinning in front of exhibits, and other towns sent messages of solidarity and inquiry. The Lakefield Museum became more than a monument to pain. It was a beacon for communities everywhere seeking a way through their darkness. The energy in Lakefield schools had changed. Morning announcements were no longer just about sports or weather. They included reminders about respect, kindness, and justice. In assembly halls and classrooms, students spoke openly about what had once been whispered or ignored. The story of Simone Harris had become more than a headline. It was a living lesson, reshaping what the next generation saw as possible. One crisp autumn morning, Simone arrived at Central Middle School, welcomed by the principal, and a wave of applause from students lining the hallways. She'd lost count of how many schools she'd visited in the last month, but each new group reminded her why this work mattered. Marcus and Sanders joined her, now familiar faces to both students and teachers. There not just as officials, but as partners in the movement. In the auditorium, banners hung with the words, "Unity, Justice, Courage." Hundreds of students filled the seats, eyes wide and curious. Simone stepped to the microphone, her voice both warm and resolute. "You are the future," she began. "You will decide what this community becomes, whether we stand together or let fear and hate pull us apart. I came here not just to tell you what happened to me, but to ask what you want to happen next." A hush fell as Simone told her story about fear, injustice, and the day she decided silence was no longer an option. She spoke about forgiveness, but also about the need to speak out, even when it was hard. Every time you stand up for someone different, every time you refuse to laugh at a cruel joke or call out an injustice, you make Lakefield and the world a little better. At the end of her talk, students were invited to share their own experiences. One boy, Jamal, stood up, shifting nervously as he spoke into the microphone. "Last year, some kids called me names because I'm black. I tried to ignore it, but it hurt. But when I heard Simone's story, I realized I'm not alone. My friends stuck up for me after, and now I want to stick up for others, too." A ripple ran through the room. Another student, a white girl named Lily, hugged Jamal and spoke into the mic. "You're not alone. We're with you." The room erupted in applause, some students wiping away tears. Teachers looked on with pride and awe. This was real change, unfolding in real time. After the assembly, small groups formed in classrooms to talk about what they'd learned. Teachers guided discussions about fairness, empathy, and courage. Marcus visited a civics class, answering tough questions about power and accountability. Sanders led a workshop on speaking up when you see something wrong, emphasizing that even adults can learn from their mistakes. By the end of the week, students began sharing their reflections online. The hashtag #IamSimone spread quickly, with young people of every background posting stories of times they'd faced or witnessed bias and what they did about it. Posts flooded in. "I was afraid to say something, but now I'm not. I stood up for my friend today. My class made a promise. No more silence." The momentum built beyond Lakefield. Other schools across the state joined in, organizing Unity Weeks and inviting guest speakers to share stories of resilience. Local news stations covered the movement, and soon, national media picked up the story. Social platforms became alive with voices, some young, some older, pledging to fight for inclusion, fairness, and mutual respect. 1 week later, the State Board of Education made an announcement. Simone's story and the movement it inspired would become part of the official social studies curriculum. Across Lakefield and beyond, teachers prepared new lessons, not just about what happened, but about how to keep moving forward. In classrooms, students debated what justice means. They wrote essays, staged plays, and drew posters, reflecting on courage and reconciliation. Simone and Marcus visited a school on the curriculum's first day, sitting in the back of a classroom as a student read aloud. "Justice isn't just something that happens in a courtroom. It's something we all build every day." Simone felt hope bloom inside her as she watched these young people, brave, compassionate, unafraid. She realized that while her fight had started with pain, it would continue in the voices and choices of every generation that followed. As the bell rang and students poured out into the hallways, their laughter echoed with new confidence. Simone knew the work was never done, but today the torch had been passed, and it was burning brighter than ever. Within a few years, the name Lakefield had taken on a new meaning, not just in America, but far beyond. The story that had once begun with a single act of violence now traveled through newsrooms, government halls, and international conferences as a living blueprint for change. Governors from other states began sending their top advisors to Lakefield to study what was now known as the Lakefield model. Delegations arrived to tour the museum, observe the police department's daily workings, and meet the citizens who had lived the transformation. Simone was at the heart of it all, her schedule filled with consultations, public panels, and mentoring sessions with leaders who wanted to bring real reform home. Reporters from every major network and even international correspondents shadowed Simone and Marcus as they guided groups through the newly rebuilt community centers, the classrooms where children now learned about justice, and the public spaces where dialogue and reconciliation had become a part of daily life. Lakefield was no longer a byword for tragedy. It was a symbol of hope. One afternoon, Simone sat in a packed auditorium as she addressed a delegation from across the country. "The first step to change," she said, "is to admit what's broken and to let those who suffered lead the repair. We didn't get here by pretending the past never happened. We got here by facing it together and refusing to let pain divide us any longer." Her words resonated, not just in the room, but across state lines. Editorials in major newspapers urged lawmakers to look to Lakefield. Policy groups published reports citing Lakefield's strategies: transparent policing, community oversight, education reform, and trauma-informed care for survivors of violence. As demand grew, Simone found herself acting as a bridge, sometimes joining virtual summits with governors, other times appearing in person at international conferences on human rights. She listened as leaders from abroad, some from nations still grappling with their wounds, asked how Lakefield turned a history of harm into a future of hope. On the cover of a national news magazine, a photo of Simone standing before a mural painted by school children, arms crossed, eyes resolute, became an instant icon. The headline read, "The Face of American Healing." Foreign outlets translated her speeches, and youth activists in other countries quoted her on social media. Justice isn't a gift, it's a job we all share. Meanwhile, Marcus worked closely with other mayors and governors, explaining the practical side of transformation, how to fund support programs, train officers in cultural competence, and ensure community voices always had a seat at the table. Sanders, too, lent his voice, offering frank testimony on the cost of silence and the courage it took to change from within. Lakefield received the prestigious International Human Rights Award that year. The ceremony, streamed live to millions, saw Simone accept the honor on behalf of the entire city. In her speech, she said, "Lakefield proved that even the deepest wounds can heal when we choose honesty and empathy over shame and fear. This is not just our story. It can be anyone's, anywhere." Back home, the city gathered for a celebration. Banners strung across the central square, a crowd cheering as the international press captured every moment. School children performed songs about justice and courage. Elders wept with joy. Local officials announced that part of the prize money would go to expanding the Victim Support Fund statewide. Simone found herself at the end of the night looking out over Lakefield's glowing skyline. She felt both awe and humility at what they had built. Together, she knew that no reform was ever perfect and that the work would never truly end. But Lakefield had done what once seemed impossible. It had become a model for a nation and a lighthouse for the world. The ripple effect spread far and wide. More states committed to real reform, citing Lakefield in legislative proposals. Delegations from overseas returned home with a new resolve to tackle old wounds. Young people everywhere posted messages. If Lakefield can do it, so can we. And as the lights dimmed, Simone's story continued, not as an ending, but as a new standard for justice in the generations to come. The grand international hall shimmered with anticipation. Flags of nations hung side by side, and a gentle hum of voices drifted beneath crystal chandeliers. Tonight, the International Justice Awards would not only honor history, but mark a new beginning. Lakefield's journey from tragedy to transformation would become a beacon for a changing world. Simone stood backstage, poised but reflective, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Her story was now known on every continent, yet the weight she felt was not pride, but a sense of deep responsibility. At her side, Marcus and Saunders watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction, remembering the dark days that had made this celebration possible. When Simone stepped out onto the stage, the applause was immediate and thunderous. She wore a simple black dress and the Medal of Justice glinting at her collar. All eyes turned to her as she approached the podium, her presence filling the vast space with a sense of possibility. She began by announcing a new tradition, the Youth Justice Award, created to honor young people who had carried the torch of change in their communities. Tonight, she said, we celebrate not only those who have endured, but those who have risen, those who take our lessons and turn them into action. Backstage, the nominees, diverse teenagers and 20-somethings from around the world, waited nervously, their stories ranging from leading local protests to organizing support networks for victims of bias and violence. When Simone called each of their names, the young winners walked out to roaring applause, beaming with pride and hope. One winner, a high school girl from Poland, described organizing the first anti-racism rally in her small town after reading about Lakefield. Another, a Nigerian immigrant in Canada, created a youth hotline for students experiencing discrimination. A third, a young man from Brazil, led a citywide initiative to train police in cultural awareness. Each story was unique, but all shared a common thread, refusing to be silent. Simone shook each winner's hand and draped the medal over their shoulders. In each face, she saw determination, the burning promise that the next generation would not let the world backslide into ignorance or hate. In her keynote speech, Simone spoke directly to the torchbearers. Every generation inherits darkness, fear, prejudice, injustice, but you also inherit the tools to drive it back: truth, compassion, the willingness to dream. Each of you, by speaking out, by showing up, has renewed the promise of hope. You are proof that change doesn't end with us. It lives on, stronger, braver, brighter. The hall rose in a standing ovation. Behind her, a montage of young activists from every continent flashed across the giant screen. Children waving protest signs, teens leading rallies, college students organizing peace walks. Hashtags like torchbearers and justice for all trended worldwide. The energy in the room was electric, a chain of courage stretching across borders. Next, a panel of youth honorees shared their vision for the future. Brielle, a young black woman from Chicago, declared, "We're not just inheriting this world, we're changing it." Simone's story showed us that it's possible, but it's up to us to keep pushing. We're ready to stand up where others once stood silent. Marcus took the stage to offer his congratulations, sharing a memory of his first protest march as a young man, and urging the crowd to keep fighting for a world where justice is for everyone, not just the privileged few. Sanders, now recognized as a champion for reform, encouraged the audience to hold each other accountable every day, in every place, because justice is everyone's responsibility. The highlight came when Simone looked out over the gathering of young leaders and, with a warm smile, spoke words that would be quoted around the world. Every generation must face its darkness, but we can choose to be the light. Each of you, no matter where you're from, what you look like, or what language you speak, can be the light that guides the way. After the formal ceremony, the hall was alive with hope and possibility. Young award winners mingled with world leaders and journalists, exchanging contact information, discussing ideas for new coalitions and campaigns, vowing to carry the flame home to their communities. There was laughter, planning, and even tears of joy. a sense that a movement begun in Lakefield was being reborn in dozens of countries at once. Simone moved through the crowd, receiving hugs from youth activists from a dozen nations. She listened to their stories, shared encouragement, and felt in their voices the same resolve that had first pushed her to stand up and speak out. It was as if she were looking at her younger self, multiplied 100-fold. Later that night, as the city's lights glowed beyond the tall windows, Simone paused in a quiet corner, watching the torchbearers. She saw them gathered in circles, planning, dreaming, and already reshaping the future in ways she could never have imagined. She felt at peace, knowing that her journey and Lakefield's story would continue in hands both strong and gentle. Meanwhile, in Lakefield, the city prepared for its first multicultural festival, a celebration not just of diversity, but of shared purpose and hope. The square where pain had once turned to protest would now host music, dance, and unity. It was clear now, though the struggle for justice would never end, it had never been more alive, more possible, or more brilliantly illuminated by those just beginning their journey. Simone smiled, knowing the torch had truly been passed, and that the light ahead would burn long after she was gone. Lakefield's central square was unrecognizable from the days of turmoil and fear. As dawn broke, volunteers moved through the plaza, stringing lights across the old oak trees and hanging banners in every color of the rainbow. Booths and tents transformed the space into a vibrant bazaar of the world's cultures. Filipino adobo simmered next to Cajun gumbo, Nigerian jollof rice next to Polish pierogi, Vietnamese spring rolls, and southern sweet tea. Musicians tuned their instruments while young dancers in everything from saris to baseball caps rehearsed their routines. From every corner, the scents and sounds of belonging drifted into the air. By noon, Lakefield's annual multicultural festival was in full swing. Families from every neighborhood, some whose roots went back generations, others newly arrived, came pouring in. Laughter and music mingled, and a dozen different languages could be heard at any moment. The festival was the city's boldest act of collective memory, a declaration that after all the pain and division, Lakefield had chosen another path. In the heart of the plaza stood a large circular stage, draped in flowers and flags. Simone made her way to the steps, pausing to greet friends old and new. Children ran up for hugs, some wearing T-shirts that read, "Lakefield Strong," others with faces painted in the patterns of their heritage. Elders gave her shy nods of respect. As she moved through the crowd, Simone saw the living evidence of change. People who once eyed each other warily now swapped recipes, stories, and phone numbers. The festival's opening ceremony began with a procession. Elders, faith leaders, students, and city officials parading side by side, carrying lanterns and banners that read "Unity in Diversity" and "One Lakefield." The parade wound around the square, weaving together the city's many threads. A hush fell as the last group approached the stage, and Simone was handed the microphone. She stood silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight before her. Thousands of faces, all looking up, a mosaic of hope. "There was a time," Simone began, her voice clear and strong, "when fear and suspicion kept us apart. But today, there are no more barriers, only friends. This festival is proof that community is not about sameness, but about seeing the beauty in our differences." The crowd erupted in applause, but Simone continued, more softly, "We have not forgotten what brought us here. The pain, the struggle, the times when justice seemed impossible. Those memories make today even more precious. Every handshake, every shared meal, every new song is a promise that we will never return to silence or to hate. We choose each other again and again." Tears shone in the eyes of some listeners. Music swelled as a local choir sang an original anthem written for the occasion, their voices echoing off the brick and glass of City Hall. Dancers took to the stage in a whirl of colors, inviting the audience to join. Soon, the entire square was moving, children dancing with elders, neighbors swinging arm in arm, even the mayor attempting a few awkward steps. As the afternoon wore on, the festival became a tapestry of stories. At one table, a Syrian refugee family shared baklava with a retired black pastor. At another, a group of high schoolers handed out poetry zines about overcoming prejudice. Marcus was stopped again and again by residents wanting to thank him for his leadership and humility. Sanders, ever more at ease, laughed with his grandchildren and explained the meaning of forgiveness to a curious group of teens. Later, as the sun began to set and the air filled with the scent of grilled corn and roasted meats, Simone returned to the main stage for the evening's final speeches. The crowd, now several thousand strong, pressed in close, some perched on benches and others sitting cross-legged on the grass. Strings of lanterns bathed everyone in a gentle glow. Simone called up leaders from every faith, teachers from every school, and representatives from local police and fire departments. "This festival," she declared, "belongs to all of us, those who have been here, those who are new, and those who are still finding their way. Today, there are no titles, only neighbors." The most moving moment came when a young family approached the stage. The father, dressed in the crisp blue of Lakefield's newest police uniform, held his son's hand as his wife carried their daughter. The officer paused, searching Simone's face, then extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity. "We were afraid to raise our family here, but you changed all of that. You gave us hope." Simone shook his hand, emotion choking her reply. "Hope is something we build together," she managed, and the officer's wife squeezed her hand in gratitude. Their little boy looked up at Simone with wide eyes. "My dad says you made this city safe for everybody," he whispered. Simone bent down, smiling. "We all did it together." Not far away, Marcus stood beside Simone, silent but deeply moved. As the crowd cheered, he slipped an arm around her shoulders. The journey had nearly broken them both, but tonight, amid the music and laughter, they knew it had all been worth it. Sanders, watching the scene, found himself pulled into a circle of dancers, old rivals and new friends alike. Someone handed him a plate of food, and he raised it in a toast to new beginnings, to courage, to never giving up. As dusk deepened, the festival reached its peak. Lanterns floated above the square, carrying written wishes and prayers into the night sky. The crowd joined hands, forming a great living ring that circled the entire plaza. Children, elders, police, teachers, store owners, faith leaders. All the old lines had vanished. Simone led the closing song, her voice joined by hundreds. The lyrics, written by Lakefield youth, spoke of rising from pain, finding joy, and refusing to let fear rule another generation. When the last note faded, the square fell silent for a moment, a collective breath, a promise renewed, and then, slowly, the people of Lakefield began to walk, hand in hand, lanterns lighting their way, stepping out of the square and into the streets beyond. From every window, from every doorstep, others watched and joined. The city, once broken, now moved as one. The festival did not erase what had been lost, but it created something stronger, a bond forged in the fires of justice and tempered by forgiveness, laughter, and love. Lakefield's future, lit by so many hands, stretched bright and unbroken into the night. The first light of day shimmered over Lakefield, painting the city's rooftops in soft gold and turning the quiet surface of the lake to polished glass. A gentle mist curled along the water's edge, where willow branches dipped low, and the city, once divided by fear, now woke as one. On the eastern trail around Lakefield's Central Lake, a growing group of people, young and old, black, white, Asian, Latino, new arrivals and longtime neighbors, had gathered for the city's now traditional sunrise run. The air was fresh, filled with laughter and the slap of sneakers on dew-soaked grass. Simone laced her shoes with a quiet smile, savoring the simple joy of the moment. Marcus jogged beside her, his steps steady, pausing every so often to greet a friend or high-five a passing child. Sanders, grinning, led a small pack of teenagers eager to race him around the final bend. No one noticed who came from where, who worshipped at which church or spoke with what accent. Only the easy belonging of bodies moving together beneath the growing sun. As they ran, the city awoke. Cafes opened. Their windows steamed from fresh coffee. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks, and music played from an open car. Families strolled with strollers. Old men sipped tea and watched the children play. And all around, the hum of unity, familiar, ordinary, miraculous in its ordinariness. Simone slowed by the lakeshore, watching the sun break fully over the water. Her breath rose in clouds, but her heart was light. One by one, runners joined her, catching their breath, stretching, and sharing jokes. People who'd once crossed the street to avoid each other now traded stories about new jobs, babies, recipes, and garden advice. It was the little things, a shared thermos of hot cocoa, a gentle word to a neighbor, a laugh that made it real. Across the grass, Marcus knelt to help a young girl tie her shoelace. Sanders caught up to an older man, a retired teacher, and clapped him on the back. Simone chatted with a group of recent immigrants, answering questions about local schools, listening as they described dreams for their children. A woman in a headscarf handed her a plate of fresh muffins. "For the hero of Lakefield," she whispered, and Simone hugged her back. Near the end of the loop, the runners gathered in a wide circle, arms draped across shoulders. The mood was festive but thoughtful. There was laughter, but also the sense of something profound having taken root. Simone stepped into the center, looking at each face. "This is what we fought for," she said softly. "Not perfection, but the freedom to belong, to wake up and know this day is ours, all of us." A film crew from a national news network moved quietly among the crowd, capturing images of the city at peace. The story would air that night. Lakefield, the city without the shadow of hatred. The camera caught Simone as she gazed at the sunrise, Marcus joking with neighbors, Sanders surrounded by kids, and 100 small kindnesses unfolding with no fanfare. The reporter's voiceover asked the question on many minds: if Lakefield could heal its deepest wounds, what might America become if every community found the courage to face the truth? The segment ended not with grand speeches or parades, but with simple images: neighbors holding hands, children skipping stones, a mother embracing her son. Lakefield's new dawn was not a single victory, but the sum of countless small choices, each one a step away from the past toward a future built together. As the sun climbed higher, people lingered on the shore, chatting and planning their day. There was work to be done and, of course, bills to pay, meetings to attend, children to teach. Justice was never a finish line. But in Lakefield, hope had become as ordinary as the sunrise. Simone looked out over the lake one last time, her heart full. She knew the journey was far from over, that the ghosts of old hatreds could always return. But now, Lakefield had the tools to meet them, with truth, with community, with the courage to love in the face of fear. Hand in hand, the people of Lakefield began to walk from the lakeshore, their silhouettes merging in the golden light, leaving behind not the memory of pain, but the certainty of possibility. The story of Lakefield would be told and retold in classrooms and living rooms, on news broadcasts and around dinner tables. and every telling would end with the same hope. The fight for justice is never finished. But from Lakefield, hope has already begun to spread across the land. Lakefield's journey is a testament to the power of truth, courage, and community. The idea that no matter how deep the scars of injustice run, real change begins the moment people refuse to accept silence or division as fate. Through heartbreak and hope, Lakefield proved that justice isn't delivered by a single hero, but is built day by day through the choices of ordinary people who choose to care, to speak up, and to act together. Forgiveness, too, emerged not as a surrender, but as an act of defiance, a refusal to let hate or fear define the future. But this story isn't just about one city. It asks each of us, when confronted with prejudice, will we speak out or look away? Will we build walls of suspicion or bridges of understanding? Can we imagine a world where justice is not a privilege, but a promise, kept for all, every day? If Lakefield could transform pain into hope, what could your community become if everyone dared to face uncomfortable truths and reach for something better? Where do you see signs of change or resistance in your city or school? What will you do the next time you see injustice, large or small? Share your thoughts below. What would a Lakefield moment look like in your world? And most importantly, are you ready to be the light when your community faces its darkness? Because the journey for justice isn't finished, and your voice might be the spark that lights the next dawn.